Welcome back to The Dead End, where we peel back the shadows to uncover the darkest truths humanity has to offer. Tonight, we begin a chilling journey, one that traces the life of the man later declared by the FBI as the most prolific serial killer in American history. His name was Samuel Little. But before the headlines, before the confessions, before the terror, there was a boy. A boy shaped by chaos, rejection, and desires no child should ever carry. In this episode, we go back to where it all began, to the dusty roads of Georgia in the 1940s, to a fractured childhood that birthed a monster. Sit tight, because what you're about to hear is not fiction. This is the beginning of Samuel Little's story. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. His entry into the world was already marked by scandal and instability. His mother, Bessie Mae Little, was a teenage girl barely out of childhood herself. Rumors swirl to this day that Samuel was actually born inside a jail cell where his mother was serving time. Whether in the cold steel shadows of incarceration or in a poor Georgia shack, one fact remains. Samuel entered life unwanted, abandoned by circumstance, and deprived of a nurturing start. Bessie Mae was overwhelmed. She was young, troubled, and unfit for motherhood. Samuel's father? Practically absent, an unknown face, a missing piece of identity he would never truly claim. By the time Samuel was an infant, he was already passed off, raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. Now, Lorain was an industrial town, diverse yet tough. For a young black boy in the 1940s, opportunities were scarce, and the streets could swallow you whole. Samuel's grandmother did her best, but the damage of rejection was already planted deep. The seed of abandonment had taken root in his psyche. As he grew, neighbors and relatives would later remember him as quiet and withdrawn. But inside, a storm was already brewing. It didn't take long for Samuel's inner demons to surface. From the earliest years of his childhood, he carried thoughts that would terrify anyone who understood them. In kindergarten, while other children laughed, played, and dreamed of innocent things, Samuel's imagination drifted elsewhere. He became obsessed with a terrifying fixation, the act of strangulation. It started with a teacher, a woman whose slender neck caught his attention. He later confessed that he would stare at her throat for long stretches, fantasizing about wrapping his hands around it and squeezing the life out of her. This wasn't a fleeting thought. It was the beginning of an obsession with domination, control, and the fragile line between life and death. As Samuel entered his teenage years, the darkness only deepened. While his peers were drawn to baseball games, music, or girls their age, Samuel devoured something else: true crime magazines. But not just any stories. He was drawn specifically to those about strangulation, often accompanied by graphic photographs and grim illustrations. These magazines became his twisted textbooks, each page feeding his imagination, each headline reinforcing the notion that taking life through strangulation was not only possible, but thrilling. It was a hunger that he would carry with him, festering quietly in the shadows of his mind. By the mid-1950s, Samuel had grown into a troubled young man. His school years were rocky. He struggled academically, often feeling alienated and out of place. But instead of finding healthier outlets, he drifted toward crime. In 1956, at just 16 years old, Samuel Little's path took its first official turn toward the criminal world. He was caught in Omaha, Nebraska for breaking and entering. What exactly he was looking for remains uncertain. Money, thrill, or simply a way to release the restless energy that consumed him. The authorities didn't treat it lightly. He was sentenced to time in a juvenile detention center. For many, this would have been a wake-up call, a chance to turn back before walking into the abyss. But for Samuel, it was only the beginning.
The system marked him as a delinquent. Society labeled him as trouble. And in his mind, the sense of rejection only grew stronger. He now had not only his mother's abandonment, but the law's confirmation that he was an outsider, a criminal, someone not meant to fit in. Little did anyone know at the time that this minor arrest was merely the opening act. Behind those detention walls sat a boy whose fantasies of strangulation had already taken root. A boy who would soon sharpen those fantasies into reality. And so the foundation was laid. A childhood of instability, a mind infected by violent fantasies, and an early taste of crime that only seemed to embolden him. Samuel Little was no longer just a troubled boy. He was evolving, slowly, methodically, into something much darker. But the world wouldn't realize the danger until decades later. In our next chapter, we follow Samuel out of his youth and into adulthood, where his petty crimes begin to escalate and the monster inside him starts to take control.
By the late 1960s, Samuel had drifted south, reconnecting with his estranged mother in Florida. For a while, it seemed like a chance at stability. He took on small jobs, working as a cemetery attendant and later as an ambulance orderly. These jobs, though simple, placed him around both death and vulnerability, environments that strangely echoed the fantasies brewing inside his mind. But Samuel was never content to settle into an honest life. He had no steady career, no ambition beyond feeding his impulses. What defined him most was his ability to drift. He became a wanderer, moving from state to state across America. And wherever Samuel went, trouble followed. By his own count, and by police records that would later surface, Samuel Little was arrested in dozens of states for a variety of crimes: shoplifting, fraud, driving under the influence, solicitation, armed robbery, aggravated assault, even rape. To the outside world, he seemed like a petty criminal, just another drifter who couldn't stay out of handcuffs. But behind that record of offenses, something darker lurked. Each arrest, each brush with the law, was a reminder of how Samuel could slip through the cracks. Cases collapsed, charges were dropped, witnesses disappeared. Again and again, he managed to escape real accountability. And every time he walked free, Samuel grew bolder. He had learned the system. He had learned how to blend into the fringes of society, circling through neighborhoods that law enforcement rarely cared to patrol, targeting people authorities barely protected: prostitutes, addicts, transient women. To Samuel, they were easy prey. The 1960s hardened him. He was no longer just a petty thief. He was practicing, preparing, testing the limits of what he could get away with. But Samuel was not just a drifter. He was a fighter. During his many stints behind bars, he discovered boxing. And once he stepped into the prison ring, he found a place where his raw aggression could be sharpened into skill. He trained hard, studied opponents, and developed a reputation as a formidable fighter. Those who watched him spar noticed his power, his reach, his speed, but most of all, his ferocity. He fought like a man with rage boiling just beneath the surface, as though every punch was personal. In the ring, Samuel Little learned more than just how to box. He learned how to dominate, how to conserve energy, how to strike at the right moment, how to use his size and strength to wear down an opponent until they had nothing left to give. And years later, when he faced his victims in dark alleys, in backseats of cars, in abandoned lots, those same skills would become his weapons. Samuel had discovered the perfect method of control: his bare hands. He did not need knives. He did not need guns. His fists, his arms, his grip, they were enough to overpower nearly anyone. It was boxing that gave Samuel Little the confidence he had always craved, the belief that no one could resist him, no one could stop him.
By the dawn of the 1970s, Samuel Little was no longer just a petty criminal drifting from town to town. He had become a predator in waiting, hardened by arrests, emboldened by the system's failures, and armed with the brutal strength of a fighter. He was ready to unleash his darkest fantasies. The monster inside Samuel Little was awake, and it was hungry. This was the decade where Samuel Little's fantasies finally crossed into reality. The line between imagination and murder was erased, and the killings began. Tonight, we step into the chilling early years of his murderous path, where the first bodies fell and where the world remained oblivious to the predator hiding in plain sight. The year was 1970. The humid streets of Miami, Florida buzzed with life. Tourists, locals, and the invisible underworld of women selling their bodies to survive. Among them was Mary Brosley, a woman struggling with addiction and poverty, trying to scrape together a living on the margins of society. To most, Mary was invisible, but to Samuel Little, she was the perfect target. He approached her the way he often would, with charm. He was not threatening at first. He knew how to disarm with a smile, how to make himself seem safe. He offered her a ride, maybe a drink, maybe some quick cash. And Mary, like so many others after her, followed him, never realizing she was stepping into the hands of a killer. Later, in his chilling confessions to law enforcement, Samuel would describe that night in haunting detail. He remembered everything. The way Mary's thin frame slumped in his car, the way her hand looked with her missing pinky tip. He recalled the jewelry she wore, a necklace that glimmered faintly in the dim light before he wrapped his hands around her throat. They drove off Route 27, away from the city lights, into a secluded area where no one could hear her scream. And there, Samuel Little acted out the fantasies he had carried since childhood. He strangled Mary with his bare hands, slowly, deliberately, watching as life slipped away. When it was over, he discarded her body like trash, leaving her behind in the shadows. To him, she was nothing more than the first chapter in a story of death that would span decades. Mary Brosley's life ended that night, and Samuel Little's life as a serial killer began. The murder of Mary Brosley was not a one-time act. It was the beginning of a pattern. Over the next decade, Samuel Little refined his method of killing. A method so consistent, so chillingly rehearsed, it became his signature. He targeted vulnerable women, those living on the edges of society. Sex workers, addicts, runaways, single mothers down on their luck. Women whom the world ignored. Women he believed would not be missed. He would lure them into his car, often under the promise of drugs, alcohol, or money. Sometimes he would pretend to be a lover, sometimes a savior. Once they were inside, his charm disappeared. That is when his strength took over. Samuel Little had the body of a trained fighter. Years of boxing in prison had given him strong arms and a deadly grip. He used that grip to subdue his victims, wrapping his hands around their throats, overpowering them until they could no longer fight back. But it was not just killing. Samuel admitted that he derived sexual pleasure from the act. Sometimes he pleasured himself while strangling his victims, his arousal tied directly to their suffering. And once the life drained from their bodies, Samuel discarded them in places where discovery was unlikely. Abandoned lots, back roads, alleys no one walked at night. He left their bodies to rot, confident that the police would never trace the deaths back to him. And for years, he was right.
What made Samuel Little especially dangerous was not just his brutality, it was his cunning. He knew exactly how to pick victims that would guarantee his freedom. He later admitted, with chilling pride, he chose women no one would miss. He stayed far away from affluent neighborhoods, never going near the kind of victims who would spark media outrage or police urgency. Instead, he preyed on those already discarded by society. Women who drifted in and out of addiction, women who sold their bodies for survival, women estranged from families who rarely reported them missing. Police departments in the 1970s and 80s were fragmented, with no centralized database linking cases across states. A body found in Miami meant nothing to investigators in Ohio. A strangled woman in Louisiana was just another statistic, unconnected to a strangled woman in California. Samuel used this to his advantage. He traveled constantly, drifting across state lines, killing wherever he went. To law enforcement, he was just another drifter. To the women he encountered, he was death itself. Case after case was closed without answers. Victims labeled as overdoses, accidents, or unsolved homicides. And Samuel, he slipped quietly into the night, moving on to his next victim. The 1970s became the decade where Samuel Little transformed from a drifter into a predator. From Miami to countless other cities, bodies began to pile up, though few connected the dots. He had perfected his method, mastered his disguise, and discovered the terrifying truth that he could kill without consequence. But this was only the beginning. In the 1980s and 90s, Samuel Little's reign of terror would expand across nearly every corner of the United States. He would leave behind dozens of bodies, each one a silent victim of his deadly grip. The killings had begun, and the world was blind to the monster in its midst. By the 1980s, Samuel Little was no stranger to the inside of a courtroom. But unlike most criminals with rap sheets spanning multiple states, he had perfected the game of escape. He had been arrested numerous times for assault, burglary, shoplifting, drug possession, and even attempted murder. Yet somehow, he always found a way to walk free or serve only brief stints behind bars. Little's secret weapon was the very foundation of America's justice system: doubt. His victims were often women on the margins of society, sex workers, addicts, and women struggling with homelessness. These were individuals whose lives were already ignored by society, and when they turned up dead or missing, few outside their immediate circles noticed. When women came forward accusing him of assault or attempted murder, jurors and judges often dismissed them as unreliable witnesses. Their lifestyles became a weapon against their own testimonies, and Samuel knew it. He once bragged that the world would never believe these women over him, a man who could present himself as calm, polite, and seemingly harmless in a courtroom. This legal loophole kept him free and gave him more confidence to continue his cycle of violence. Each acquittal was not just a release from jail, it was validation, proof that he was smarter, stronger, and more cunning than the system designed to stop him. The 1980s and 1990s were decades of transience for Samuel Little. He became a drifter in the truest sense of the word, with no permanent home, steady job, and no family ties strong enough to anchor him. He moved from city to city, sometimes staying just long enough to find work as a laborer, cemetery worker, or car wash attendant before slipping away under the cover of night. Investigators later uncovered that Little committed murders in at least 19 different states during this period. From Florida to California, from Ohio to Mississippi, he treated America's highways as his hunting grounds. Each new town meant fresh opportunities to blend in and fresh victims who had no idea they were crossing paths with a predator. His consistency was frightening. Authorities believe he killed at least one woman per month during some stretches of the 1980s, strangling them and discarding their bodies in alleys, fields, or secluded roadside ditches. Many of these victims were never identified. Their disappearances were chalked up to runaways, overdoses, or accidents, which meant Little was free to vanish before suspicion could catch up. The hallmark of Little's criminal career in these decades was his ability to leave behind murders without closure. His victims were women often overlooked by society, and when they vanished, police departments rarely devoted the same level of resources they might for someone from a wealthier or more socially visible background. When families did report women missing, those cases often got lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy.
Different jurisdictions rarely shared information, and DNA databases were still in their infancy. Samuel thrived in this gap, knowing that each new town represented a clean slate. This allowed him to kill with chilling freedom, confident that few investigators would link the dots between crimes in Los Angeles and Miami, or between Louisville and Houston. What gave Samuel Little an added edge was his body. He was not just an average man. He was a trained fighter, a skilled boxer from his years in prison. His muscular arms, once honed in the ring, became deadly tools of strangulation. Unlike guns or knives, strangulation left little evidence behind, especially in cases where coroners misidentified causes of death. Overdoses, natural causes, or accidents were often cited instead, meaning autopsies failed to reveal the truth. This made it nearly impossible for investigators in the 1980s and 1990s to connect multiple unsolved murders to a single suspect. What is most terrifying about this era is how ordinary Samuel Little seemed. He was not hiding in the shadows of abandoned buildings or lurking only at night. He walked freely in broad daylight, sat in diners, chatted with strangers, and lived in cheap motels. His ability to switch personas was uncanny. Around law enforcement, he could be soft-spoken and respectful. Around women, he could be charming and disarming, even flirtatious. But beneath that facade was the same darkness that had haunted him since childhood. Every arrest, every courtroom dismissal, every short prison sentence only reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. And in a chilling way, he was. Because through the 1980s and 1990s, Samuel Little remained a free man, killing at will, leaving devastation scattered across America.
In September of 2012, Samuel Little's decades of drifting came to a sudden halt. Police in Louisville, Kentucky, acting on a narcotics warrant, picked him up at a homeless shelter. To many, it was just another routine arrest of a man who had spent much of his life on the fringes of society. But this arrest would prove to be the beginning of the end for America's most elusive serial killer. After his arrest, Samuel was extradited to California to face the outstanding drug charge. But what investigators did next would change everything. As part of standard procedure, police collected a DNA sample from him. That single swab was the thread that began to unravel decades of unsolved cases. His DNA was entered into the national CODIS system, and almost immediately, red flags appeared. The results shocked investigators. His genetic profile matched evidence recovered from 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles, crimes dating back to the late 1980s. These were not ordinary cold cases. They were brutal strangulations of women whose bodies had been discarded in alleys and abandoned areas. For decades, their killers had remained a mystery. Now, at last, there was a name tied to the evidence: Samuel Little. Detectives in Los Angeles, long haunted by the unsolved murders of Carol Alford in 1987, Audrey Nelson in 1989, and Guadalupe Apodaca in 1989, suddenly had a living suspect in their hands. But investigators knew DNA alone was not enough to secure a conviction. They built their case meticulously, revisiting crime scene photos, interviewing surviving family members, and tracking Samuel's movements during the late 1980s. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Little had been in Los Angeles at the time of the killings, and his method of strangulation aligned perfectly with the cause of death in each case. To prosecutors, the case was not just about proving Samuel guilty, it was about ensuring this man would never again walk free. In 2014, Samuel Little stood trial in Los Angeles. For the first time, the man who had hidden in plain sight for more than 40 years faced a jury with evidence too strong to deny. The prosecution leaned heavily on the DNA matches, but they also presented a chilling portrait of a man who had preyed upon society's most vulnerable women, strangling them with his bare hands. They highlighted his history of arrests, his violent past, and his pattern of targeting women who were unlikely to be missed.
Defense attorneys tried to cast doubt, pointing to the age of the cases and the lifestyle of the victims. But the science was irrefutable. DNA, silent for decades, spoke louder than any witness could. On September 25, 2014, the jury found Samuel Little guilty of the murders of all 3 women. The verdict was a long-awaited victory for families who had waited more than 20 years for justice. The judge wasted no time in handing down the sentence: 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. For Samuel Little, it meant he would die behind prison walls. For law enforcement, it meant they had finally caged a predator who had slipped through the cracks for far too long. At the time, few could have predicted what this conviction would unleash. Investigators suspected Samuel was connected to more than just 3 murders. But how many more? That answer would only come later, when Samuel himself began to talk. For now, in 2014, the justice system finally had him where he belonged, locked away, with no chance of freedom.
By 2018, Samuel Little had already been serving his life sentence in California. Many believed his story had reached its end. But inside those prison walls, another chapter was about to unfold, one that would shake the very foundation of American criminal history. Texas Ranger James Holland, widely respected for his ability to get the truth out of even the most hardened criminals, traveled to California to speak with Little. What started as a routine interrogation soon became one of the most staggering confession sprees in United States history. Over days, weeks, and eventually months of conversation, Samuel Little began to open up. He described murders stretching back decades, murders nobody even realized were connected. By the time he stopped, he had confessed to 93 killings spanning from 1970 to 2005. His memory was chillingly precise. He recalled the shape of a jawline, the color of a dress, even the exact road where a body had been dumped decades earlier. He spoke with no remorse, often in a detached tone, as if recounting memories of routine events. Investigators quickly realized they were not dealing with a man exaggerating for attention. His details matched too closely, his recollections too specific. He was not just confessing, he was reliving his crimes. The FBI stepped in, launching one of the most comprehensive cold case reviews in modern history. Using its violent criminal apprehension program, agents and analysts began cross-referencing Little's confessions with unsolved homicides across the country. The results were staggering. Case after case lined up with Little's accounts. The FBI ultimately confirmed over 50 murders with strong evidence and deemed the rest highly credible. This meant one chilling fact: Samuel Little had become the most prolific serial killer in American history. His ability to evade capture for decades was not luck alone. It was a result of targeting victims society often overlooked. Many were poor, addicted, sex workers, or transient. Their disappearances drew little media attention, and when their bodies turned up, their cases often went cold. Little knew this. He admitted he chose women no one would miss. It was part of his strategy for survival, and it worked for more than 40 years. Perhaps the most haunting element of Samuel Little's confessions was his artistic ability. During interrogations, he began sketching portraits of his victims entirely from memory. With colored pencils and paper, he recreated the faces of dozens of women he had strangled, some from encounters nearly half a century earlier. The accuracy of these drawings stunned investigators. Many surviving relatives of missing women recognized features instantly: eyes, cheekbones, or hairstyles that had not been seen in decades. In 2019, the FBI made the unusual move of releasing dozens of Little's portraits to the public, accompanied by details he recalled: a location, a car, a piece of jewelry. The hope was that communities across the country could help finally put names to the unidentified victims and bring closure to families who had been waiting for answers. The response was overwhelming. Families of the missing began contacting law enforcement, and several women in Little's drawings were positively identified after decades of being nameless. But many remain unidentified even today, haunting reminders of just how many lives he destroyed. By the time investigators pieced together the scope of his crimes, it was clear that Samuel Little's confessions were not just about solving cold cases. They were rewriting the history of American crime. 93 victims, more than half confirmed, dozens still unverified. A trail of violence stretching from Florida to California, Ohio to Texas, and nearly everywhere in between. Samuel Little, a man once dismissed as a petty drifter, had concealed one of the largest killing sprees the country had ever known.
Samuel Little understood something about society that few killers ever articulated. Certain lives would not draw the same urgency or resources if they went missing. He preyed almost exclusively on women who lived at the edges of society. Black women, sex workers, drug users, runaways, and the homeless. These women often lived transient lives, estranged from their families or communities, and their disappearances rarely triggered widespread searches. To Little, they were the perfect victims. He admitted he chose women he believed would not be missed, turning human vulnerability into a method of survival. Decades later, when investigators finally retraced his confessions, they found that many of these women were never even reported missing. Others had been dismissed as overdose cases or unsolved accidents. Little thrived in those blind spots, making their invisibility his cover. Little's decades-long killing spree also exposed deep systemic failings in law enforcement. During the 1970s through the 1990s, the United States had no centralized system for tracking violent offenders across states. Jurisdictional boundaries acted like walls, preventing police departments in Florida from knowing what was happening in California, or detectives in Ohio from comparing notes with their counterparts in Texas. Each murder appeared isolated. Each case stood on its own. Without DNA technology in its early years, and with limited cooperation across states, Little slipped through the cracks again and again. But perhaps most damning were the societal biases that shaped investigations. Victims who were poor, addicted, or engaged in sex work were often treated as less credible or less worthy of justice. Many cases were deprioritized, their files gathering dust as Little kept moving, killing, and escaping undetected. In retrospect, Little did not just exploit weaknesses in the system, he exposed them. His story became a disturbing reminder that justice often depends on how much society values the victim. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little's reign of terror finally ended, not at the hands of justice, but through nature's inevitability. At age 80, he died in a Los Angeles County hospital while serving 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Though the exact cause of death was never publicly detailed beyond health complications, what mattered more was that a man who had silenced so many voices finally became silent himself. The walls of his prison cell had become the cage that kept the most prolific killer in United's history contained. Samuel Little confessed to 93 murders. The FBI has since confirmed over 50, making him the deadliest known serial killer in American history. His tally dwarfs notorious names like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer. Yet what made his legacy even more haunting was not just the number of victims, it was who those victims were. Women deemed disposable by society, women who deserved protection, but instead were forgotten. Samuel Little's crimes forced law enforcement and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives are valued and whose lives are overlooked. Little's story continues to echo. The Starz documentary Confronting a Serial Killer brought renewed attention to his crimes, focusing on the techniques used by investigators to draw out his confessions. Even after his death, investigators are still attempting to verify some of his confessions, hoping to give long-denied closure to families. His hand-drawn portraits of victims, eerily accurate down to details of hairstyles and jewelry, still circulate in public databases, each sketch representing a human life still waiting to be named. Samuel Little leaves us with chilling but necessary lessons. 1. Evil thrives in silence. He targeted those he believed no one would fight for. Society's neglect became his camouflage. 2. Systemic failures cost lives. Lack of cooperation across states and biases against marginalized victims gave Little decades of freedom to kill. 3. Every life matters. Whether rich or poor, housed or homeless, every disappearance deserves urgency. Every victim deserves dignity. 4. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Though many of his victims never saw justice in their lifetimes, his confessions gave answers to some families after decades of uncertainty. Samuel Little is remembered not for who he was, but for the darkness he represents, and the spotlight he unintentionally cast on the cracks within the justice system. This is where Samuel Little's story ends, but not where ours does. Evil does not die with one man. Around the world, there are other chilling cases, hidden crimes, and untold horrors lurking in the shadows of history. Stay tuned, because in our next Faceless Deep Dive, we uncover another nightmare that proves monsters do not just exist in movies, they walk among us. Like the video, give your thoughts on this dark history by commenting. Also, do not forget to share with your friends. This is The Dead End, and the road ahead only gets darker.